Clara Jensen never imagined her life could pivot because of a dare, tossed casually into the smoky air of a crowded party high above the lights of San Francisco. She had always been the dependable one, the one who showed up on time, turned in assignments early, and followed every rule to the letter. From her small-town Oregon upbringing to the polished halls of her architecture program, Clara had been defined by words like steady, disciplined, safe. Her designs were clean, elegant, structurally flawless, but never risky, never wild, never alive. Until that night. The party was cramped and overheated, pulsing with cheap wine and relentless music. Clara stood near the window, sipping water, trying not to feel entirely out of place. That's when Beth, eyes lit with mischief, pulled up an article on her phone. Julian Cade, the prodigy pianist turned tech mogul, is reportedly renting a private soundproof suite at Bloom Conservatory. Just him, a piano, and silence. No press, no streams, no audience, Beth added, voice tinged with curiosity. Just him and whatever ghosts he's trying to play out of his system. Julian Cade, once the youngest solo performer at Carnegie Hall, then the mind behind Cade Audio, the app that reshaped music as the world knew it. And then he vanished. No interviews, no concerts, only rumors. Maybe he's hiding, someone said, or healing. Beth turned to Clara, grin spreading. You always sketch buildings and beams. Things that hold. What would happen if you drew something alive in a moment that could collapse? Clara laughed. The dare sounded absurd. I'm serious, Beth pressed. Sneak in, sit in the back, sketch him. Just once. That's the bet. Clara wasn't impulsive. She wasn't reckless. But that evening her heart was sore, raw from a brutal critique by her professor. Technically sound, he had said, but there's no risk. No soul. Maybe that was why, as Beth's challenge hung in the air, Clara quietly nodded. All right, she said, lips barely moving. A foolish dare, a reckless whim. But maybe, just maybe, it was the start of something real. Clara never truly thought she would go, but just before midnight the next evening, she found herself standing before the heavy wooden door to Julian Cade's private suite. Sketchbook pressed tightly to her chest, her heart pounding so loudly she could almost hear it in her ears. She didn't know what had brought her this far, pride, impulse, or a flicker of curiosity she had always refused to entertain. The door gave a soft click as it opened. Clara stepped inside, barely breathing. The room was bathed in warm amber light, stretching across the high ceilings and polished wooden floor. No stage. No audience, just a Steinway grand piano, and a man seated with his back to her. Julian Cade. He wasn't wearing a shirt. His presence was immediate, unignorable, not because it was provocative, but because it was honest. Bare skin, sculpted in soft light. Not perfect, not posed, just real. His shoulders were broad, defined. The blades of his back shifted slightly with breath. His spine curved gently downward, like a silent melody resting beneath his skin. He looked like something ancient and restless, like a sculpture that had decided to exhale. Clara felt like an intruder, and yet she couldn't look away. She had spent years drawing structures, angles, and beams and tension points, but never something that held life this fragile and this powerful. He sat still, hands resting on the keys. His dark brown hair fell messily around his temples, like sleep had only just released him. Clara slowly pulled out her sketchbook. Her hands trembled, but she began to draw. The curve of his spine, the gentle rise of muscle near his ribs, the shadow where light kissed his shoulder. Each line felt like she was sketching something sacred. She didn't know how long passed, 5 minutes, 10, before he stirred. Just the slightest tilt of his head, as if sensing a shift in the air. Then he turned. Clara froze, pencil suspended in air. His eyes found hers, steady, deep, unreadable. For a heartbeat, the entire room went still. He didn't flinch. didn't cover himself. He just looked at her, as if she belonged there. "No one ever dares to watch me when I'm not performing," he said, voice low and even, like a note held too long. Clara flushed crimson, backing away, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. I'm sorry," she stammered, moving toward the door. But before she could leave, his voice stopped her again, calm, quiet. "What's your name?" "Clara?" He nodded slowly. "Come back tomorrow, Clara." And somehow she knew she would. Clara didn't sleep that night. She lay in her tiny rented room, staring up at the cracked ceiling, her mind echoing with the memory of Julian's eyes, his quiet smile, and that voice, deep and unhurried, whispering like a note that wouldn't fade. "Come back tomorrow, Clara." She didn't know why those words had settled so deeply in her chest. Julian hadn't commanded her. It hadn't been a polite request either. It felt inevitable, as if he already knew she would return. And he was right. The next afternoon, Clara told no one. She slipped her sketchbook into her bag and boarded the subway toward Bloom Conservatory, her heart beating faster than usual. This time, there was no hesitation, no sneaking. When she arrived, the assistant at the front desk barely looked up before nodding, as if she'd been expected. Julian was waiting. When she opened the door, the room was different. No piano, no spotlight, just a warm space, lit gently, with a small table and 2 cups of coffee steaming quietly between them. Julian sat there, clothed this time, but still with that same strange calm. He motioned for her to sit, wordlessly. And somehow Clara obeyed, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They sat across from each other, silent. It was Julian who spoke first. "Why did you really come here?" A simple question, but it found the softest part of her. Clara bit her lip, opened her mouth, then closed it again. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know, I just wanted to see if I could be brave, even once." Julian tilted his head slightly, and something in his eyes softened. "And did you feel brave?" She gave a quiet laugh. "I was terrified." He smiled too, a small, honest curve of his mouth. "Good," he said. "That means you still have something to lose. Fear means hope." Clara didn't understand why she felt safe here, with a man who was still mostly a stranger. But something unspoken had started to form in that room. Not love, not yet, but a thread. Thin, quiet, binding them gently together across the silence. That day, there was no mention of music, no talk of sketches, but as Clara stood to leave, Julian spoke just once more. "Tomorrow night," and she nodded. The evenings became a quiet ritual. No one spoke of it. There were no messages, no formal invitations, but each night, as dusk crept in, Clara would take a different turn, away from her usual route home, and head instead toward Bloom Conservatory, toward a quiet room and a man who waited inside. They didn't do much. Often, they simply sat across from one another. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they didn't. But the silence was never awkward. It was the kind of silence that made you feel heard, even when you hadn't said a word. Julian wasn't chatty. He asked simple questions, but they were sharp, precise, cutting through layers Clara hadn't realized she'd built. "What do you remember most about the house you grew up in?" A simple question, but it made Clara pause, sift through years of memory. "The wind through the door in winter," she said. "It always sounded like someone whispering something you weren't supposed to hear." Julian nodded slowly, like he'd known that sound all his life. The more they met, the more Clara realized that Julian wasn't like anyone she had ever known. He didn't rush. He didn't pretend to care, but he was present, fully, quietly, devastatingly present. He listened as she talked about school, about drawings she'd never shown anyone. One evening, she brought a few sketches, intending to skim through them, but Julian sat beside her, studying each line like it held a secret worth waiting for. And slowly, Clara began to study him the same way. She noticed how he paused after speaking, as if pulling words from a long, forgotten place. How his laugh softened the air. How his hands that had once commanded entire concert halls, trembled just slightly when he turned a page in her sketchbook. Neither of them named what was growing between them, but it was there, undeniable, silent, like a song without melody. Emotion had never been named between them. There were no confessions, no lingering glances, no intentional touches, but it was there, quiet and steady, like a melody playing beneath every silence they shared. And then, one night, something shifted. Clara arrived later than usual. A light drizzle had soaked her sleeves, and the chill of the wind still clung to her skin. When she stepped into the familiar room, Julian was already there, standing silently by the tall window, watching the city lights blur in the rain. One hand held a mug of steaming tea, its warmth fogging the edge of his cheek. The other hand rested loosely in the pocket of his dark wool sweater. He turned when the door clicked shut. Their eyes met. Something in the air slowed. His gaze didn't rush, but it didn't avoid her either. It held a quiet expectation and a hint of something vulnerable, like he'd half prepared himself to be disappointed. "I thought you'd changed your mind," Julian said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I almost did," Clara admitted. "I thought maybe if I stayed home and stayed quiet, everything would just stop. But then I realized I didn't want it to." He said nothing, just set his mug down and walked toward her, slowly, deliberately, like each step mattered more than he could say. "When you're here," he said, standing just a breath away, "I remember what it's like to want something. Not because it's smart or necessary, but because it's beautiful and real." She didn't know what to say. His words reached into her chest, peeled back every layer of restraint, and held her heart in his hands without ever touching her. Clara inhaled sharply. Her thoughts spun, but her body had already decided. She lifted her hand, gently brushing the inside of his wrist. He looked at her, didn't move, didn't flinch, and she didn't pull away. 1 second, 2, 3, then he touched her back, lightly, not trembling, just answering, a quiet harmony to the note she'd begun in silence. They didn't kiss, there was no need. Julian sat first, then glanced at her. Clara joined him, their shoulders touched. Her hand remained in his. They stayed like that for a long time. No words, no movement. The room warmed around them as if time had folded itself inward and left only this, their breath and each other. Julian rested his head gently against her shoulder, not with romance, but with trust, as though for the first time in years, he allowed himself to stop holding everything together. Clara closed her eyes, letting the weight of him settle into her like a promise. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel the need to prove anything. She didn't have to be strong or clever or worthy. She just had to be there. As she stood to leave, Julian spoke, softly, barely audible. "Thank you for coming back." Clara didn't answer. She just squeezed his hand, slightly, but with certainty. The line between them had finally vanished, not in a rush, but with the gentlest of touches. But they didn't know that in their quietest moment, the outside world had already started to slip in. Not with noise, but with a phone call. Silent, calculated, and sharp as a blade. That afternoon, Clara was alone in her small apartment, adjusting lines on a sketch for her next assignment. Late sunlight stretched across the wooden floor, catching the edge of her sleeve. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She hesitated, then picked up. "Clara Jensen." A man's voice, low, controlled. "This is Marcus Cade." The room seemed to still. Marcus Cade. The name needed no introduction. Julian's older brother, CEO of Cade Audio, the face of everything Julian had walked away from. "What is this about?" Clara asked, keeping her voice calm. "This isn't a threat," Marcus said. "I'm not here to intimidate you. I'm speaking as the man who once had to drag my brother out of something most people don't come back from." Clara said nothing. "Julian's not a gentle tune, you know. He's a full-blown symphony, chaotic, relentless. If you haven't seen him fall apart, then trust me, you don't really know him." Each word fell like ice. "I know he's been meeting you at Bloom Conservatory. I know he's starting to forget why he left the world in the first place." Clara's grip on the phone tightened. "Do you think this thing between you can survive the spotlight? You think you'll be okay when the press starts digging into who you are, where you come from? They won't be kind, Clara. And he'll disappear again." A pause. "The thing is, I don't think you want to hurt him," Marcus continued. "I believe you mean well, but sometimes loving someone means not being the one standing beside them." The line went dead. Clara stood still, the silence in the room now deafening. Outside, the wind had picked up. Her shadow on the floor trembled ever so slightly. That night, she still went to Bloom Conservatory, still sat beside Julian, still listened as he spoke about an old book, a melody he was rewriting. She smiled, she nodded, but deep inside her, something had started to stir, a quiet, uncertain note, the beginning of an ending. Clara never told Julian about the call from Marcus, but from that night on, something in her began to shift, quietly, slowly, like a door inching closed. The evenings at Bloom Conservatory continued. They still sat side by side. Julian still spoke of melodies he was rewriting, still asked her questions that made her pause and think. But inside Clara, a dissonant note had begun to ring. She stopped bringing her sketchbook, not because she didn't want to draw, but because she was afraid that if she did, she would have to capture what she was slowly losing. Julian didn't notice at first. He was observant, but he also trusted deeply, trusted Clara, trusted what they were building, until one evening when he smiled and handed her a half-finished sheet of music, asking, "What do you think this part needs?" Clara didn't answer right away. She looked at the page, then at him, and couldn't say the thing that had been pressing against her chest for days. That night, she stayed later than usual. She didn't sleep. She sat in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the city beyond her window, like a symphony with no center. The next morning, Clara rose early. She didn't go to Bloom Conservatory. Instead, she wandered through the city, retracing steps she had taken alone before Julian. She went looking for herself. She rented a tiny studio in an old artist quarter. She pulled out old sketches she had hidden in drawers, and she began to draw again. Not for anyone, not for praise, not even for Julian, but for herself. Longing filled his strokes. Loss became light. The drawings were no longer soft or perfect. They were raw, honest, nearly aching. One afternoon, she dropped off a canvas at a small gallery in the Mission District. The gallery owner, an older man with silver hair and round glasses, studied her work, then looked at her quietly. "You're the one who draws him," he said. Clara froze. I don't know what you mean." But he only smiled gently. "I've seen a lot of artists draw because they're chasing something, but you draw to remember." And that night, for the first time in many nights, Clara let herself hope. Maybe love wasn't about walking away to protect someone from yourself. Maybe love was learning how to stay when the storm arrives. The call came on a rainy afternoon. Raindrops clung to the window like time itself had slowed, each second stretching endlessly. Clara sat by her desk, phone in hand, staring at the number she knew by heart. She had asked herself for days, is he still waiting, or has he learned to forget? There was no answer, only the echo between two heartbeats. Finally, not because of logic, but because her heart couldn't bear the silence any longer, she called. Julian was alone in his office, the warm light casting a golden haze over his shoulders. He wasn't working, just watching the city through the glass, dim streetlights, wet roads, and her absence playing like a wordless song he couldn't turn off. When the phone rang, he turned instantly. Her name lit up the screen. His heart skipped a beat. He picked up on the second ring. "Clara," he said, barely above a whisper, like calling out a dream that had returned unexpectedly. There was a pause. Then, With a trembling voice, she spoke. "I'm sorry. I thought I had to leave to protect the best of what we had. But all I did was run away from the only place I've ever truly belonged." Julian closed his eyes. His chest felt like it had cracked open, only to be mended by the sudden return of something he'd stopped hoping for. "I'm home," he said, simply, honestly, like everything they had ever been. That night, Clara stood in front of his apartment, the door she had once entered with uncertain steps, now trembling again because she knew exactly where it led. Snow was falling softly. She hadn't even knocked when the door opened. Julian was waiting. Their eyes met. And for a heartbeat, the world stepped back. No words. He walked toward her slowly, cautiously, as if she might vanish if he moved too fast. Then his arms wrapped around her, secure, gentle, whole. Clara buried her face in his chest, right where his heartbeat echoed loud and steady. She breathed in the scent she hadn't realized she missed. Warm cedar, a hint of sea air, and something like home. His hand rested lightly at the back of her neck, not to hold, just to touch. But that touch alone broke her. Tears slipped free, quiet and unstoppable, like the rain falling earlier that day. They stood that way for a long time. No one counted the seconds. No one needed to speak. Julian held her closer, as if trying to memorize the shape of her. "I'm not sure how much of you I still get to keep," he murmured, "but I never stopped waiting for you to come back." Clara clutched his shirt, terrified that letting go would mean losing him again. She looked up, eyes red but steady. "I don't want perfect love. I just want someone who will walk through the cracks with me." Julian lowered his head. His lips met hers in a kiss, gentle, patient, certain. When his lips brushed gently against hers, the world seemed to hold its breath. There was no crash, no blinding light, only a silence so sacred it felt like grace, where old wounds were soothed by a familiar breath, where the unsaid was spoken through a single kiss. It wasn't the kiss of new lovers, it was a quiet vow between two souls who had once lost each other and now, without condition or promise, were choosing again. In that moment, Clara understood she didn't need forever. She just needed this, real, deep, and wholly present. It wasn't a beginning. It wasn't forgiveness. It was return, not "we're starting over, we're still here." We never truly left. They didn't say anything more that night. They didn't have to. In that silence, something unspoken was understood. That from this moment on, they wouldn't just find each other again, but learn how to stay. They didn't call it starting over, nor did they need to say things like, "let's try again," or "give us another chance." Neither of them felt the need to define a love that had never truly disappeared. It had only gone quiet for a while, silenced by fear, pain, and words that weren't ready to be spoken. But now, nothing needed to be said. Clara didn't move in with Julian permanently, yet nearly every evening found her back in the apartment where the kitchen light was always on, where a coat hung waiting for her and a warm cup of tea stood at 9 p.m. She kept her own world intact, her small apartment, her familiar studio, but Julian's presence had become essential in her quiet hours. They didn't label their relationship, they didn't call it anything grand, but everything they did said the same thing. "I'm still choosing you." In the mornings, they woke together, sometimes early for Julian's meetings, sometimes late because Clara wanted to linger under the covers, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath the pillow. Julian made coffee, black, strong, the only thing that could clear his mind. Clara still preferred hot cocoa, or Earl Grey with a hint of cinnamon. Their different habits didn't need to be changed. They were the small, distinct notes that made up the quiet harmony between two people who were never the same, but never out of sync. Clara began taking on more art projects, this time with confidence. Her sketches carried new tones, not just soft landscapes or polished still lifes, but vivid, raw emotions. Sometimes it was Julian's hands holding a cup of coffee, or his back lit by warm lamplight, or her own eyes as she imagined how he saw her. She didn't need to draw his face for people to know. It was the light he gave that shone through her work. Julian remained absorbed in his business, but Clara noticed something new: white spaces in his calendar, evenings with no calls, mornings with no meetings, time for Clara, or sometimes just time for silence. Quiet jazz playing, pages turning, pencils gliding over paper. They didn't need big gestures. Some nights, Julian simply sat watching Clara draw, his gaze never leaving her hand. Sometimes Clara would walk over and kiss his forehead, then return to the couch, just enough to say, "I still see you. I still choose you." Their love wasn't a blazing flame anymore. It was steady, certain, a hearth fire that burned quietly through the night. No one needed to witness it. No one else had to understand. The old wounds were still there, like scars that never fully fade, but they learned to live with them without denial or shame. Some nights Clara woke from restless dreams and Julian would simply hold her hand. Other times he stared long at an unread email, the weight in his eyes unspoken, but Clara would rest her hand on his shoulder, and it was enough. She understood. They didn't talk about someday. They didn't make long-term plans. But each morning, Julian brewed her favorite tea, and each night, Clara set her phone aside to give him her final hour. They needed no promises. They just chose each other. Every single day.